The afternoon of September 23rd, 1964, was warm in Harlem, with temperatures reaching 78 degrees and bright sunshine illuminating the streets and buildings of the neighborhood. By 2:30 in the afternoon, most children had been dismissed from school for the day, and the sidewalks along Lenox Avenue and the numbered streets were busy with students walking home, stopping at corner stores and gathering in small groups to talk and play. Teachers were finishing their duties for the day, grading papers, preparing lessons for the following day, and organizing their classrooms for the next morning. Dorothy Henderson was 42 years old and had taught fourth grade at public school 103 on West 131st Street for 17 years. Henderson had grown up in Harlem, attended the same public schools where she now taught, and had earned a teaching degree from Hunter College in 1946 before beginning her career in the New York City public school system. Henderson lived in a small apartment on West 135th Street that she shared with her mother, and she walked the 4 blocks to PS 103 each morning to begin her teaching day. Henderson's classroom on the 3rd floor of PS 103 served 28 students, all black children from Harlem families who lived within walking distance of the school. The classroom was furnished with old wooden desks that had been used for decades, chalkboards that were cracked and difficult to clean, and inadequate lighting from fixtures installed when the building had been constructed in 1908. The school district provided minimal funding for supplies, allocating approximately $15 per classroom per year for basic materials including paper, pencils, chalk, and books. This allocation was insufficient to meet the actual needs of Henderson's students. Many came from families living in poverty, unable to afford their own school supplies. Henderson regularly purchased additional materials from her own modest teaching salary to ensure her students had paper to write on, pencils to use, and books to read. Over her 17 years of teaching, Henderson had spent thousands of dollars of her own money supplementing the inadequate district funding. On this particular afternoon, Henderson had finished her teaching day and was preparing to walk to Woolworth's department store on 125th Street to purchase supplies for the upcoming month. Henderson had calculated that she needed approximately $45 worth of materials, including composition notebooks, pencils, erasers, construction paper, crayons, and workbooks. Henderson had budgeted this amount from her September paycheck, which after rent, utilities, food, and support for her mother left limited discretionary income. Henderson arrived at Woolworth's at approximately 3 o'clock and spent 30 minutes selecting the supplies her classroom needed. Henderson chose the least expensive options available, buying generic notebooks instead of branded ones, basic pencils rather than higher-quality alternatives, and minimal quantities of construction paper and crayons. After gathering everything she needed, Henderson brought her selections to the checkout counter, where the total came to $47.35. Henderson reached into her purse for her wallet and counted the cash she had brought. She had $43. Henderson was short by $4.35. Henderson asked the cashier, a white woman approximately 30 years old named Sarah Mitchell, if she could return some items to bring the total within her available funds. Mitchell responded that the line behind Henderson was growing long and that Henderson should have calculated her total before bringing items to checkout. Henderson apologized and began sorting through her purchases to determine what she could eliminate. Henderson removed 2 packages of construction paper and 1 box of crayons, and reducing her total to $41.90. This created a different problem. Henderson now had more money than needed, but returning items to retrieve additional materials would further delay the line. Henderson asked Mitchell if she could quickly get 2 more packages of construction paper to use the remaining funds. Mitchell stated loudly that Henderson was holding up other customers and needed to complete her transaction immediately or step aside. Mitchell's tone was sharp and carried clear impatience. Several customers in line behind Henderson looked at her with visible annoyance. Mitchell added that if Henderson could not afford to shop at Woolworth's, perhaps she should try cheaper stores where people with limited means typically purchased items. Henderson felt her face grow warm with embarrassment. The comment about affording to shop at Woolworth's stung deeply, particularly because it was said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Henderson was a professional with a college degree who worked full-time as a teacher, yet she was being treated as though her poverty disqualified her from shopping at an ordinary department store. The humiliation was compounded by the public nature of the interaction, with multiple customers witnessing Mitchell's dismissive treatment. Henderson did not respond to Mitchell's comment. Henderson completed the transaction silently, paying $41.90 for her reduced selection of supplies. Henderson gathered her purchases, placed them in her shopping bag, and walked out of Woolworth's without looking back at Mitchell or the other customers. Henderson's hands trembled slightly as she walked, and tears formed in her eyes, but she maintained her composure until she was outside on the street. Henderson walked the 6 blocks from Woolworth's back to her apartment on West 135th Street. During this walk, Henderson's initial embarrassment gradually transformed into deeper reflection about the situation she had just experienced. Henderson recognized that her humiliation at Woolworth's was not primarily about Sarah Mitchell's rudeness or the annoyed customers in line. The deeper problem was systemic. Public school teachers in Harlem were paid so little and received so little institutional support that they could not afford basic classroom supplies without personal financial sacrifice. Henderson had spent 17 years purchasing supplies from her own salary because the school district allocated inadequate funding. Henderson was not unique. Every teacher she knew at PS 103 and at other Harlem schools spent personal money on classroom materials because district allocations were insufficient. This pattern reflected broader inequalities where schools in white neighborhoods received adequate funding, while schools in black neighborhoods operated with chronic shortages that teachers were expected to address through personal charity. Mitchell's comment about Henderson not being able to afford Woolworth's had exposed this systemic failure in a moment of public humiliation. Henderson earned approximately $4,800 annually as a teacher with 17 years of experience, after basic living expenses, and Henderson had limited discretionary income. Spending $45 monthly on classroom supplies represented nearly 10% of her take-home pay. This burden was unsustainable and unjust, yet Henderson and her colleagues accepted it as normal because they saw no alternative. Henderson arrived at her apartment and sat at her kitchen table examining the supplies she had purchased. The reduced quantity would last approximately 2 weeks instead of the full month she had planned for. Henderson would need to return to purchase more supplies in mid-October, requiring another $45 she could not easily afford. This cycle repeated monthly throughout the school year, creating constant financial pressure and forcing Henderson to make difficult choices between her students' needs and her own financial stability. As Henderson sat at her kitchen table, her mother, Virginia Henderson, came into the kitchen and asked if Dorothy was feeling well. Dorothy explained what had happened at Woolworth's and described the ongoing financial burden of purchasing classroom supplies. Virginia listened carefully and then made a suggestion that would change the trajectory of the situation entirely. Virginia stated that Dorothy should speak with someone who might be able to help address the school's funding problems. Virginia mentioned that she knew people who knew Bumpy Johnson, and that Johnson had a reputation for helping Harlem residents facing difficulties. Dorothy initially resisted this suggestion. Johnson was a known criminal, and Dorothy was a respectable professional who avoided associations with illegal activities. But Virginia pointed out that Johnson regularly helped community members and that addressing the school's funding crisis would benefit not just Dorothy, but all the students and teachers at PS 103. Virginia emphasized that Dorothy had spent 17 years sacrificing her own financial well-being to help students, and that accepting help to create sustainable solutions was not shameful, but responsible. Dorothy considered her mother's suggestion over the following 2 days. During this time, Dorothy discussed the supply shortage with other teachers at PS 103 and learned that every classroom faced similar problems. The school's principal, Robert Williams, acknowledged that district funding was inadequate, but stated that budget decisions were made at levels beyond his control. Williams encouraged teachers to continue purchasing supplies personally and assured them their dedication was appreciated, but this appreciation did not address the fundamental problem. On September 25th, Dorothy told her mother that she was willing to explore whether Johnson might be willing to help. Virginia contacted a neighbor who had connections to people in Johnson's organization, and within 2 days, a message came back that Johnson would meet with Dorothy on September 29th at a restaurant on Lenox Avenue to discuss the situation. Dorothy arrived at the restaurant at 6 in the evening as instructed. She was nervous about meeting someone with Johnson's reputation, but was determined to present the school's needs clearly and professionally. Johnson was already seated at a corner table when Dorothy arrived. Johnson was 59 years old, dressed in a well-tailored suit, and had a calm, controlled demeanor that contrasted with Dorothy's expectations of what a crime boss might be like. Dorothy explained the situation methodically. She described that PS 103 served 512 students in grades kindergarten through 6th. The school district allocated approximately $15 per classroom per year for supplies, totaling approximately $270 for the school's 18 classrooms. This amount was grossly insufficient. Teachers spent personal money averaging $40 to $50 monthly to purchase basic materials students needed. Over a 9-month school year, this represented $400 to $450 per teacher, totaling approximately $8,100 across the school's 18 teachers. Dorothy explained that this personal spending was unsustainable for teachers earning modest salaries. Many teachers at PS 103 were women supporting families on single incomes. The financial burden of purchasing supplies created genuine hardship and forced teachers to make choices between their students' educational needs and their own financial stability. The humiliation Dorothy had experienced at Woolworth's was merely one visible manifestation of a systemic problem affecting every teacher and every student at the school. Johnson listened carefully to Dorothy's explanation without interrupting. After Dorothy finished, Johnson asked several questions about the school's enrollment, its budget structure, what specific supplies were needed most urgently, and whether the principal would cooperate with outside assistance. Dorothy answered each question thoroughly, demonstrating comprehensive understanding of the school's operations and needs. After approximately 40 minutes of discussion, Johnson stated that he would consider how to address the situation and would contact Dorothy within 1 week with a decision. Johnson emphasized that if he decided to help, the assistance would need to be structured to create sustainable solutions rather than merely providing temporary relief. Dorothy thanked Johnson for his time and left the meeting uncertain whether anything would come of the conversation. Over the following week, Johnson thought systematically about the situation Dorothy had described. Johnson recognized that the problem had multiple dimensions requiring different types of intervention. The immediate need was funding to purchase supplies for the current school year. But the deeper problem was systemic underfunding that would continue unless structural changes occurred. Johnson understood that simply donating money for 1 year's supplies would address immediate needs, but would not prevent the problem from recurring. Johnson developed a comprehensive strategy that addressed both immediate needs and systemic problems. The strategy had 4 integrated components: providing immediate funding for supplies for the 1964 to 1965 school year, establishing a sustained funding mechanism that would continue for multiple years, building coalition support among community leaders to create accountability, and creating pressure on the school district to increase official allocations. The first component was immediate supply funding. Johnson calculated that providing adequate supplies for all 18 classrooms at PS 103 for the full school year would require approximately $10,000, accounting for basic materials plus some enhanced resources like books and educational materials beyond minimal supplies. Johnson could provide this funding directly from his own resources without significant financial burden. The second component was sustained funding. Johnson decided to commit to funding PS 103's supply needs for 5 consecutive school years from 1964 to 1965 through 1968 to 1969, totaling approximately $50,000 over the 5-year period. This extended commitment would allow the school to plan effectively, or would prevent teachers from needing to spend personal funds, and would demonstrate to the school district that alternative funding sources existed when official allocations were inadequate. The third component was coalition building. Johnson recognized that managing a 5-year educational funding program required oversight and accountability that extended beyond merely providing money. Johnson enlisted several people to participate in managing the program. Reverend Marcus Williams, who led a large church in Harlem, agreed to serve as public face of the program and to provide oversight, ensuring funds were used appropriately. Eleanor Washington, an attorney who handled various matters for Johnson's organization, agreed to establish a legal structure that would hold and disperse funds. Thomas Chen, An accountant who managed financial records for several Harlem businesses agreed to maintain detailed records of all expenditures and to ensure transparency. The fourth component was creating pressure on the school district. Johnson understood that his 5-year funding commitment would eventually end, and that sustainable solutions required the district itself to increase allocations to Harlem schools. Johnson contacted Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., who represented Harlem in the United States House of Representatives, to inform Powell about the private funding program and to request that Powell investigate why schools in Harlem received inadequate district funding compared to schools in other neighborhoods. Johnson also contacted community newspapers, including the Amsterdam News, to ensure coverage of the funding program that would create public pressure on district officials. On October 6, 1964, Johnson contacted Dorothy Henderson and arranged another meeting to present his decision. Johnson explained that he would fund all supply needs for PS 103 for 5 consecutive school years, beginning with the current 1964 to 1965 year. Johnson outlined the oversight structure involving Reverend Williams, Eleanor Washington, and Thomas Chen. Johnson explained that teachers would submit supply requests to a committee that would approve and purchase materials, eliminating the need for teachers to spend personal funds. Dorothy was stunned by the scope of Johnson's commitment. She had hoped for perhaps one-time assistance with the immediate crisis, and not a comprehensive 5-year program. Dorothy asked how the arrangement would work practically. Johnson explained that Eleanor Washington would establish a fund called the PS 103 Educational Support Program. Teachers would submit monthly requests listing supplies needed. The Oversight Committee would review requests, approve appropriate expenditures, and arrange for purchases. Supplies would be delivered directly to the school. Records would be maintained documenting every transaction. Dorothy asked what Johnson wanted in return for this extraordinary generosity. Johnson stated that he wanted 3 things. First, that the program be administered professionally with complete transparency and accountability. Second, that teachers focus their energy on teaching rather than on fundraising or personal sacrifice. And third, that Dorothy and other teachers speak publicly about the inadequacy of district funding to create pressure for systemic change. Dorothy agreed to Johnson's conditions. Over the following week, Dorothy met with Principal Williams to explain the funding program. Williams was initially skeptical about accepting money connected to organized crime, but Dorothy emphasized that the alternative was continuing to force teachers to sacrifice financially or allowing students to lack basic materials. Williams agreed to cooperate with the program provided that oversight mechanisms ensured proper use of funds. The PS 103 Educational Support Program began operating in late October 1964. Eleanor Washington established a bank account funded with $10,000 for the 1964 to 1965 school year. Teachers submitted supply requests to a committee consisting of Dorothy Henderson, another teacher named Sarah Morrison, Principal Williams, Reverend Marcus Williams, and Thomas Chen. The committee met monthly to review requests and approve purchases. The first month's requests totaled approximately $850 and included composition notebooks, pencils, erasers, construction paper, crayons, textbooks, maps, science materials, and art supplies. The committee approved all reasonable requests and arranged for purchases to be made through wholesale suppliers who offered better prices than retail stores like Woolworth's. Supplies were delivered to the school in early November. The transformation in teachers' working conditions was immediate and substantial. Teachers who had spent years purchasing supplies from personal funds suddenly had access to adequate materials without financial burden. Dorothy Henderson received notebooks, pencils, and other basics for all 28 students in her classroom, plus additional educational materials she had never been able to afford previously, including world maps, science experiment supplies, and quality art materials that allowed students to engage in projects that had been impossible when supplies were scarce. Other teachers experienced similar transformations. Sarah Morrison, who taught second grade, received children's books that allowed her to create a classroom library where previously students had shared a handful of worn textbooks. Michael Chen, who taught sixth grade, received science equipment including magnifying glasses, basic chemistry supplies, and biology materials that enabled hands-on learning experiences that demonstrated scientific concepts more effectively than merely reading about them. The program's impact extended beyond merely providing adequate supplies. The elimination of financial burden reduced teacher stress and allowed teachers to focus energy on instruction rather than on managing scarcity. Teachers planned more ambitious lessons knowing materials would be available. Student engagement increased because learning activities became more varied and interesting when supplies were adequate. The school's atmosphere shifted from one of making do with insufficient resources to one of educational possibility. Word of the PS 103 Educational Support Program spread throughout Harlem's educational community during the 1964 to 1965 school year. Teachers at other schools asked Dorothy Henderson about the program and inquired whether similar arrangements might be possible for their schools. Dorothy explained that the program was specifically structured for PS 103, but suggested that other schools should document their funding shortfalls and should seek community support from various sources. Congressman Powell's investigation into school funding disparities began in early 1965. Powell's staff examined budget allocations across New York City's school districts and documented that schools in predominantly black neighborhoods, including Harlem, received substantially less per-pupil funding than schools in predominantly white neighborhoods. Powell raised these disparities in congressional hearings and in communications with New York City officials, creating public attention to the systematic underfunding of schools serving black children. The Amsterdam News published articles in December 1964 and March 1965 describing the PS 103 Educational Support Program and highlighting the contrast between private funding providing adequate supplies while official district allocations remained inadequate. The articles quoted Dorothy Henderson and other teachers explaining that the program had transformed their ability to teach effectively, but that the need for private funding demonstrated the failure of public institutions to serve Harlem's children equitably. The 5-year funding program continued through subsequent school years with increasing sophistication and impact. The 1965 to 1966 school year funding totaled approximately $11,000 as the program expanded to include not just basic supplies, but also enhanced educational materials, including additional books, musical instruments for a music program, sports equipment, and field trip funding that allowed students to visit museums and educational sites. The 1966 to 1967 school year added funding for teacher professional development, allowing PS 103's teachers to attend conferences and training programs they could not previously afford. The Oversight Committee refined procedures over time to maximize the program's effectiveness. Thomas Chen's detailed financial records demonstrated complete accountability, with every expenditure documented and justified. But Reverend Williams's public role provided community credibility and ensured that the program maintained high standards of transparency. Eleanor Washington's legal structure protected the fund's assets and ensured proper administration. The program created ripple effects throughout Harlem's educational ecosystem. Other community organizations and churches began exploring how to provide similar support to schools. Business owners in Harlem donated materials and funds to schools in their neighborhoods. A culture developed where supporting education became a visible community priority, with multiple actors contributing resources that the school district failed to provide. The school district's response to the PS 103 educational support program was complex. Some district officials privately acknowledged that the program demonstrated the inadequacy of official allocations, but publicly they emphasized that schools should rely on district funding rather than private support. Other officials argued that private funding created inequities between schools and that all schools should receive equal district resources rather than some schools receiving supplemental private support. These responses highlighted the district's unwillingness to address the fundamental problem of inadequate and inequitable funding. By the 1967 to 1968 school year, the PS 103 Educational Support Program had created measurable improvements in educational outcomes. Student test scores at PS 103 increased compared to previous years, though isolating the program's specific contribution from other factors was difficult. Teacher retention at PS 103 improved, with fewer teachers leaving for positions at better-funded schools. Student attendance increased as the school developed reputation for having adequate resources and effective instruction. The program also created unexpected benefits related to community pride and engagement. Parents became more involved with the school, volunteering time and attending events, partly because the school was functioning more effectively, and partly because the community investment in the school created sense of collective ownership. Local businesses donated additional resources and services, contributing to a virtuous cycle where success attracted further support. Johnson maintained minimal public profile regarding the program throughout its 5 years of operation. Johnson attended one school event in 1966 where students performed in a music program funded by the Educational Support Program, but Johnson otherwise remained largely invisible. Reverend Williams served as the public face of the program, crediting community support rather than attributing the program to Johnson personally. This approach protected both Johnson and the school from criticism about connections between education and organized crime, while allowing the program to function effectively. The fifth and final year of the program, 1968 to 1969, was complicated by Johnson's death in July 1968. Johnson had made arrangements ensuring funding continued through the end of the 5-year commitment, even if he died before the program concluded. Eleanor Washington administered the program's final year from the fund's remaining resources, providing approximately $9,000 for supplies and materials during the 1968 to 1969 school year. The program concluded in June 1969 as originally planned, having provided approximately $52,000 over 5 years to PS 103. The final accounting documented that every dollar had been spent on educational materials and programs that directly benefited students and teachers. Thomas Chen's records were comprehensive enough to demonstrate complete transparency and accountability. The program's conclusion created immediate questions about how PS 103 would function without the private funding that had sustained it for 5 years. Principal Williams and teachers lobbied school district officials to increase allocations to replace the private funding that was ending. The district increased PS 103's supply allocation for the 1969 to 1970 school year to approximately $30 per classroom annually, double the previous $15, but still far short of what the educational support program had provided. The gap between what the program had provided and what district funding offered forced PS 103 to adjust. Teachers resumed spending some personal money on supplies, though the amounts were smaller than before the program had existed because the school had accumulated some durable materials like books and equipment that did not need annual replacement. The school also developed stronger relationships with community donors who continued supporting the school after the formal program ended. The broader legacy of the PS 103 educational support program extended beyond the specific school it had funded. And the program demonstrated that adequate educational resources produced measurable improvements in teaching effectiveness, student engagement, and educational outcomes. The program created model for community-based educational support that other organizations replicated in various forms. The program generated public attention to funding disparities that contributed to broader conversations about educational equity. The program also illustrated fundamental tensions in how education was funded and governed. The fact that a criminal organization could provide better educational support than the official school district highlighted failures of public institutions to serve all children equitably. The program created temporary improvement for one school, while systemic inequities persisted throughout the district. The program's success made visible what adequate funding could accomplish, while simultaneously demonstrating that such funding depended on private charity rather than being guaranteed as a public right. For Dorothy Henderson and other teachers at PS 103, the 5-year program represented a transformative period when they could teach effectively without personal financial sacrifice. Henderson continued teaching at PS 103 until her retirement in 1976, and she frequently spoke about the educational support program as an example of what schools could accomplish when adequately funded. Henderson became an advocate for increased public funding for education, using her experience with the program to argue that the dramatic improvements it enabled should be standard rather than exceptional. And the program's oversight structure, combining community leadership through Reverend Williams, professional administration through Eleanor Washington, and rigorous accountability through Thomas Chen, became a model that other community-based educational programs adopted. The emphasis on transparency and documentation demonstrated that privately funded educational programs could maintain high standards of accountability that protected both donors and recipients. The relationship between Johnson's criminal activities and his educational philanthropy created ongoing debate in Harlem about how to understand his legacy. Some community members emphasized Johnson's support for education and his investment in children's futures as evidence of positive community commitment. Others argued that money derived from drug trafficking and other illegal activities could not redeem the harm those activities caused, regardless of how the money was subsequently used. This debate reflected broader questions about whether criminal leaders who support their communities through selective philanthropy should be celebrated or condemned. The PS 103 Educational Support Program ended in 1969, but its influence on educational funding conversations continued for years afterward. When school district officials proposed budget cuts affecting Harlem schools in the 1970s, community activists cited the PS 103 program as evidence that adequate funding produced results and that cutting resources from schools that were already underfunded would cause measurable harm. When state education officials considered funding formulas, and advocacy groups used the PS 103 example to demonstrate disparities between what schools needed and what official allocations provided. The quiet nature of the program's administration, minimal publicity, no dramatic announcements, consistent execution over 5 years, professional oversight ensuring accountability, reflected Johnson's understanding that sustainable programs required systematic management rather than dramatic gestures. The program succeeded not because Johnson made a large one-time donation that generated headlines, but because Johnson committed to sustained funding over multiple years and built administrative structures that ensured proper use of resources. For the 512 students who attended PS 103 during the program's operation from 1964 to 1969, the impact was concrete and lasting. And students who might have learned to read using worn textbooks shared among multiple children instead had their own books. Students who might have written on scrap paper using broken pencils instead had adequate supplies. Students who might never have participated in science experiments or art projects instead experienced hands-on learning that demonstrated concepts more effectively than mere lectures. These improved educational experiences created opportunities and developed capabilities that affected students' entire educational trajectories. The statistical evidence of the program's impact was imperfect but suggestive. PS 103's standardized test scores improved by approximately 12% on average across tested grades during the 5 years of the program's operation compared to the 5 years immediately preceding it. As student retention improved, with fewer students transferring to other schools. Teacher retention also improved, with average teacher tenure at PS 103 increasing from 3.2 years before the program to 4.8 years during the program. These improvements could not be attributed solely to the educational support program, as multiple factors affected educational outcomes, but the correlation between adequate funding and better results was clear. The program also demonstrated that teachers could be significantly more effective when not burdened by financial stress related to purchasing supplies. Time that teachers previously spent worrying about how to afford materials or deciding which essential items to cut from limited budgets was redirected to instruction and student support. Energy that teachers expended managing scarcity was instead focused on educational planning. This shift in teachers' working conditions affected quality of instruction in ways that benefited every student. The legacy of Dorothy Henderson's humiliation at Woolworth's in September 1964 extended far beyond that single embarrassing incident. Henderson's willingness to seek help, despite discomfort about approaching someone with Johnson's reputation, created a program that transformed education for hundreds of children. Henderson's advocacy for the program and her public testimony about funding disparities contributed to broader awareness about educational inequity. Henderson's example encouraged other teachers to speak publicly about inadequate resources rather than quietly absorbing personal financial burdens. The program ended in 1969, but the precedent it established influenced educational funding conversations for decades afterward. Community-based educational support programs that developed in Harlem and other underserved neighborhoods during the 1970s and 1980s often cited the PS 103 educational support program as a model, demonstrating that adequate resources produced measurable improvements. Advocacy organizations fighting for equitable school funding used the program as evidence that resource disparities caused real harm and that addressing those disparities created real benefits. The story of how a teacher's humiliation purchasing school supplies led to a 5-year educational funding program became part of Harlem's collective memory about how communities addressed institutional failures through self-organization and mutual support. Whether the specific details were remembered accurately or whether the story evolved through retelling, the narrative captured essential truths about systemic educational underfunding, about community responses to institutional neglect, and about how strategic long-term commitment could create meaningful change, even within unjust systems. The calm conclusion of the program in June 1969, funds properly accounted for, final supplies delivered, teachers expressing gratitude, students continuing their education, administrative records filed, represented the kind of quiet success that characterized Johnson's most effective interventions. There were no ceremonies, no dramatic pronouncements, no calls for recognition. And the program had accomplished what it was designed to accomplish. 5 years of adequate educational resources for teachers and students who had previously made do with chronic scarcity. The transformation was real, documented, and lasting, requiring no exaggeration or celebration to demonstrate its value.